Hello, everyone. People are joining. We have the waiting room. Welcome, everyone, to Powerhouse's very first virtual event. This is a launch for Adrienne Raphel's Thinking Inside the Box. We're very thrilled to be able to give the launch a digital home in anticipation of being able to reschedule the real thing. And you can buy the book at powerhousebookstores.com. Let's see. The link should be in the event link that got you here, and then we'll also put that in the chat box as well. And so just to draw everyone's attention to that, you can go to the chat box, and let's see. I think everyone should be able to type in there and say hello. All right. So let me introduce our the Adrienne and Nadja Spiegelman, who will be joining as moderator. Nadja Spiegelman is the author of the memoir, I'm Supposed to Protect You from All This, as well as 3 award-winning children's books, including Lost in NYC. She is the co-editor of Resist, a newspaper of political comics by women artists, and the editor of the Paris Review Online. Adrienne Raphel has written for The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The New Republic, Slate, and Poetry, among other publications. Her debut poetry collection, What Was It For?, won the Rescue Press Black Box Poetry Prize. Born in southern New Jersey and raised in northern Vermont, she holds an MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop and a PhD from Harvard. So I will hand it over, and then throughout and afterwards, you can ask questions using the Q&A function on the bottom, and definitely feel free to chat as well. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Oh, I'm so excited to get to be here with you, Adrienne. If not live in person, then at least in a way where people can admire the similarity of our hair.
More so.
I think you can tell it's a humid day. I wish we could be doing this in person, but it's gonna be great to be doing it this way. I think you wanted to start maybe by reading a small section of it.
Yeah, and thank you so much again. This is, I mean, it's just, I'm considering this like a bonus round of we get to do this now in the virtual sphere, and then as a preview of coming attractions for the future. And hi to everyone here. I'm just, thrilled to be in whatever virtual space is. I'm thrilled to be here with all of you. So thank you, Nadja. So I thought that I would start really quickly, just a few minutes, reading from the book, Thinking Inside the Box. And I wanted to just read a little bit about the crossword craze in the other 20s, the 1920s, because I like to think we're going through a golden moment for crossword puzzles and for thinking about crossword puzzles right now. There's been a lot of, people sharing their just growing New York Times crossword puzzle streaks. But the crossword craze was something that really began in 1924 when the first crossword was 1913, but 1924 was when the first book of crossword puzzles came out, and that was really when crosswords became a crazy fad. So by the end of 1924, readers everywhere had gone crossword crazy. Gillette Burgess, a humor editor and author most famous for his 4-line nonsense ditty, The Purple Cow. I never saw a purple cow. I never hope to see one, but I can tell you anyhow, I'd rather see than be one. He celebrated the craze by submitting a crossword to the New York World. On the occasion of his first puzzles publication in November 1924, Burgess commemorated the event through self-parody. The fans, they chew their pencils. The fans, they beat their wives. They look up words for extinct birds. They lead such puzzling lives. Crossword enthusiasts wore their devotion on their sleeves with grid-patterned dresses, jackets, jewelry, and special wristbands with tiny dictionaries strapped to them, like Fitbits. One solver, who was equally zealous with a needle, created a quilt featuring 48 separate embroidered crossword puzzles, one for each state in the Union. The University of Kentucky offered a class on crossword puzzles. Puzzlers danced to crossword puzzle blues and crossword mama, you puzzle me, but Papa's gonna figure you out. Solvers could eat their words with crossword cream biscuits made by Huntley and Palmer's Limited. In 1925, Broadway triple threat Elise Janis wrote, directed, and starred in Puzzles of 1925, a review that featured a crossword sanatorium for puzzlers whose obsession had driven them to insanity. Contests of all stripes were big in the 1920s, particularly ones that involved some sort of grueling feat of discipline for a useless skill. Dance marathons, flagpole sitting, egg-eating races, yo-yo competitions, gum-chewing contests, and even a noun and verb rodeo in the Park Avenue Armory on Christmas Day, 1928, in which the competitor who could keep talking the longest was promised a $1,000 prize. Puzzle contests, a popular subset of the contest mentality, merged seamlessly with the crossword craze. Newspapers and magazines ran crossword contests for cash, making the crossword not only a game you played against yourself to while away a commute, but a way to show off your intellect with your friends and family and, as an added incentive, turn a profit from your prowess. Crosswords diverted readers from novels to grids, and crossword contests wreaked special havoc on booksellers and libraries. Bookstores blamed crosswords for lagging sales of novels, but had trouble keeping reference books such as dictionaries and glossaries in stock. Traditional volumes moldered as readers dove into puzzles. A 1924 Reuters report from Canada claims, crossword puzzles and the radio have been given as the reason for a marked decline during the recent months in the demand for books at the Ottawa Public Library. But the facilities themselves were far from abandoned. Indeed, as in the case of bookstores, demand for dictionaries and encyclopedias overwhelmed reading rooms, particularly when prizes were attached. As literary critic Elaine Scarry has pointed out to me, the crossword puzzle was seen by libraries and bookstores as the same kind of threat as online booksellers, a new technology changing the way people use text. The annual report of the New York Public Library for 1924 gives a tart indictment of the craze. Puzzles have their place, notes the report, as recreation in the hospital or on an ocean voyage or a railroad journey or as a cure for insomnia. But when the puzzle fans swarm to the dictionaries and encyclopedias so as to drive away readers and students who need these books in their daily work, the report sniffs, can there be any doubt of the library's duty to protect its legitimate readers? I'll stop there.
I love that. I love the descriptions of crossword fashions and wrist dictionaries and quilts. I know you gathered a few images. Maybe you can show them to us later. We'll go to them after that way we can talk for a second. But I'm really excited to see them. I haven't seen them yet. I wanted to ask you about, I love knowing that when crossword puzzles first became this major craze, there was this terror that somehow this was going to stop productivity in the US, that like people were just going to be doing so many crossword puzzles that no work was going to get done, and these injunctions against sort of as if there was things idling and lazy. And you have this great line in your book, crosswords signal busy people idling or idle people busying themselves, which I've been thinking a lot recently. I think everybody has about productivity, because I think we're sort of in this moment when suddenly, like, us Americans who have been so focused on producing, there's suddenly this moment when like the most important thing that you can do for your country is just stay home and bake sourdough bread, and binge watch something on Netflix, and a total rethinking of what productivity means. And that is also flipped with the crossword, right? Like it used to be seen as something that people are doing when they're idle, and now that's a little bit different. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, no, I love that I'm glad you brought that up, and I love that the crossword was sort of the menace. It's this, troubling thing, right? It's the thing that's going to like pull everybody down into, I guess, like a grid-shaped vortex of just, some sort of world in which we're all doing puzzles. But, and I think that there's also a way in which crosswords can then get flipped to use as a sort of stimulus to wake up your brain. A lot of people, millions of people, start using crosswords on commutes to like on the way to work to get into a ritual of, okay, now I'm transitioning from whatever my morning was into like a focused zone. Or at night you can do the opposite. I'm transitioning from whatever my day has been back into myself. So I think that the crossword, it sort of came, and it also like did this cultural flip from signaling just abject, like who are these people who spend their days puzzling. It did a definite like switch, and I would say maybe the most permanent like marker of that switch was in 1942, when the New York Times starts adopting a crossword puzzle and says, okay, as the New York Times, as like the gray lady, we are this, august publication, but we too have a crossword, and it's the best crossword puzzle. That's what we want it to be. So I think that really was a marker in America of a cultural shift from like, oh, the crossword is this pastime to, okay, the crossword is actually a routine. It's a part of your day. And then it's a shift into like, wow, I'm just signaling my virtue. I'm super smart. I can do the crossword.
And not only signaling virtue, but as you point out multiple times through the book, signaling a certain kind of leisure class intellectualism.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's signaling like virtue, and I am part of this particular kind of class of people who do the crossword.
One thing that was interesting to me too is that, and these shifts seem like somewhat contemporaneous, is that it, in the ways that the crossword is seen, it goes from being something that is something someone's auntie might do to becoming this world that's much more dominated by men. And can you talk a bit? I mean, there's so many. You cut through the question of gender in so many different interesting ways through your book. And can you talk about that more global one of sort of how it shifts from one thing to another?
Yeah, it's such a fascinating, looking at gender through the crossword. I mean, it's so fascinating how the crossword, maybe you would think of it as like this sort of siloed off thing in the culture that, is just its own little bubble, but yet gender issues get filtered and cycled, and you see them come up in interesting ways. One thing I think is really interesting is that the first major crossword editor, Margaret Farrer, so Margaret Featherbridge Farrer is a woman, right? And like she's the first kind of dominant voice in crossword editing. And then for a long time, crossword editing, at least among like major publications, was just kind of male. And Professor Ben Tausig and wrote about this, and Anna Schechtman has written about this, Natan Lass. People have been noticing that, okay, as with anything, if you have the people in power are of a particular demographic, like say they're all male, maybe that's conscious, maybe it's unconscious bias, like then the crossword itself starts tilting more male. And it is true that people who construct crosswords, just the ratio of men to women in them is really imbalanced, and it's really just like you see a lot more men in the crossword construction space than women. What's really cool is that, as I mentioned, like today people are noticing this, like, and trying to correct it. Like March was like sort of women's march in crosswords. Some instructors were noticing, and there's been so much push you know, happening right now to realize, wow, the people who are constructing and editing are not representative of the millions and millions of diverse people who do the crossword.
Mm-hmm. You go through a number of reasons for it in your book that I found so fascinating. Do you want to talk a little bit about why that imbalance gets created?
Like why there's like so many men constructing versus yeah. There's been like there were lots of kind of thoughts about the like there were some theories tossed around in the early 2000s about when crossword software became more popular. Then like at the same time there was like a corresponding ratio, like the number of female constructors started lowering. So there were some theories that like as with other STEM fields and technologies, like women were sort of being pushed out. That was one theory around it at that time, which I found like sort of really interesting. Like, wow, like even crosswords, sort of this like very like seems like technologically basic, but then like not immune to kind of shifting tides and shifting conversations around that. And other things that were happening, you know, it's really interesting. The first like crossword ingenue, basically, like the idea that there's a crossword ingenue, weird, but like there was this woman in the 1920s, Ruth von Poole.
I loved reading about her. That was one of my favorite parts of the book.
Von Poole is just incredible. So she's like the best crossword solver of the 1920s. She's, you know, winning all these tournaments. She gets portrayed in the media in this extremely gendered way. It's like, wow, it's really super great for crosswords that like a pretty young woman is a great solver. And it's like, come on, guys, she's got a brain, you know? But yeah, so then so she's the best solver, and then she gets sick of crosswords and says, nope, I need something else to do with my life, and she becomes one of the best James Joyce scholars in the world. Yeah, so like I think with her, she's really interesting because like the very fact that the media was making so much about like, wow, this young woman is a great crossword solver, who would have ever thought, against the stereotype, really shows that like there is a stereotype around the people who are the best in this field, and it was often for a long time not women. I'm glad it's changing now.
Which also cuts into another theme that runs through your book that's so interesting, which is like the relationship between crosswords and literature, and the different ways in which we can use words. You talk about so many of the different writers who were fascinated by crosswords, like Nabokov and Auden, one of my favorite parts of the book, you also talk about how, I have so many different favorite parts now, but you also talk about how the etymology of the word clue is a ball of yarn, because of the Theseus myth, where he uses yarn to get out of the labyrinth, and then sort of relate that to the idea of how those same string metaphors are used in narrative as unknotting, as, I mean, even just spinning a yarn. Is a puzzle a narrative?
I mean, it's been so interesting, and that's how I, you know, got into looking at crossword puzzles, is looking at crossword puzzles and literature and words and thinking about that relationship. I think of a crossword puzzle as kind of more, more like a poem than like a narrative, in that it's asking you to do all sorts of different kinds of juxtapositions of words. I think I saw Chris Spade in the chat here. He told me once that he started like understanding, maybe he'll correct me in the chat, understanding how to do crosswords and read John Ashbery at the same time, because of all the kind of jump cuts that crosswords and Ashbery ask you to make. So like clues ask you to, you know, make certain kinds of assumptions about language, and they can lead you on false paths, and then they can direct you and misdirect you. So I think of crosswords as each clue, the relationship between each clue and each answer is like a mini poem or a mini riddle. You don't quite know what that relationship's going to be when you get into it, but when you're there, you're like, oh, aha, that's great. That's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really really nice. And then you also trace, I mean, just the ways in which constructing crossword puzzles entails real artistry and go through the different styles that different crossword constructors can have. How does one arrive at, just to begin with, how does one arrive at the word constructor? Because at some point, Stephen Sondheim, who loved crossword puzzles, calls them crossword composers. One could also be an author of a crossword puzzle. How does one arrive at the word constructor, and what does that imply?
Yeah, that's and in England they're called setters,
Mm.
which I love too. And I can't really see, I don't know, there might even be some crossword constructors, setters, authors, composers here. But I mean, I think I like the word constructor because it's such a, both kind of mathematical and mechanical process. Because building a or creating a crossword is so much about getting the letters in the grid correct. So, and by correct, it means like, you know, how can I fill in this grid to make all the words fit, and how to like get words that aren't just super weird crossword words in there. How do I make the crossings happen? How do I have like a delightful idea for a pun, but then I put the words in and I realized like all the corners is in like JXQZ. Like not helpful to anybody. So I think I like constructor because it really points to that mechanical aspect. But I mean, the thing about it is it does, it makes it sound almost a little too mechanical. It's like, oh, you're a constructor, it's workmanlike. But I think that it's such a combination of that logic of, when you put something in one place and then you have to make tiny shifts, and the tiny shift over here has the butterfly effect of making this whole other corner dissolve. So constructor feels appropriate for that. Composer, I mean, sure, Sondheim, we can give the composer of.
The Sondheim quote I'm thinking of is that you quote is, there are crossword puzzles and then there are crossword puzzles. So can you tell us about the second kind of crossword puzzle? How does one elevate a crossword puzzle?
Yeah, so in that quote, that's when Sondheim is bringing cryptic crosswords to America. So cryptic crosswords, the British style of crosswords, where it's not just one or two layers of wordplay in each clue. It's like 18 layers of wordplay in each clue, right? It's like, it's each clue has like 5 different kinds of puns in it, and then you run it backwards and they're all scrambled, and like each word in each clue is so particular and has a particular different kind of meaning. So Sondheim, that's how you elevate a, you know, American style quick grid of, oh, you have to know what this river in Africa and that Bantu wildebeest is, into you know, one of my favorite examples is of a great cryptic clue is like Pretty Girl in Crimson Rose. This is the title of somebody's memoir. Pretty Girl in Crimson Rose, and it's 8 letters. And the answer is rebelled. So the pretty girl, Belle, is in the center of R-E-D, red, like rebelled. And so a pretty girl in crimson. And then rose, like rebelled, means like uprising. So it's bananas. It's so good. And see how like Sondheim, you know, wants us to compose all of those layers of wordplay just to get to that answer.
And then you go through different crossword constructors throughout time and their different styles. Can you talk a little bit about the different styles of crossword composing, constructing, writing?
Yeah, and maybe even maybe it's even more. We can think about also different styles of like editing and what puzzles get out there too, because like so before 1993, which is when Will Schwartz takes over at the New York Times, like crosswords in the New York Times, which is like really the dominant crossword, publication in America for a long time, right? Probably is, it is now. So those crosswords were really like, let's appeal to, we were talking about this earlier, this kind of certain kind of intellectualism, this certain kind of like, if you were an upper crust white male who had taken a certain class at Yale in 1957, you will understand what this clue is. So
right, you say that editor Maleska becomes a kind of metonym. The name of the editor becomes a metonym for a certain kind of New Yorker.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like you're a Maleska New Yorker. It's so New York centric. It's so like certain kind of elite centric. So the crosswords like have these like quotes built into them that are so like you only understand the in-joke either if you know these people or if you've been doing Maleska puzzles for 20 years. But now I think what's like really cool about the crossword is there's a huge growing diversity of the kinds of crosswords that are getting composed, like and the kinds of clues that are like sneaking into the crossword too, the cultures that's there. Finally like RAE, that's going to be much more likely to be clued as like Issa Rae from Secure rather than I don't know, something much more like of a certain kind of culture. But yeah, and also I think just the fact that not all crosswords have to be Maleska crosswords anymore. They can be total, they can look so different and have different kinds of wordplay and clues going on in them.
And yet one of the things that you start your book with basically is the more crosswords change, the more they stay the same. And it's one of the fascinating things about tracing the evolution of this is that there have been so many different revolutions in terms of like an old guard and new guard having crossword puzzles that are more punny, bringing in more modern things to clue. But the actual format of the puzzle has been really resistant to innovation. You talk about how there was an audio puzzle at some point where all the clues were being read aloud by Will Shortz and were pieces of songs, but that didn't take off. And then you talk about all these other like inventions that feel like technological inventions, the same way that you talk about the invention of the crossword itself as being a technological disruption, like a gridless crossword puzzle and things like that, and yet they never stick. What is it about this format of the crossword that is so enduring and that is so resistant to changing?
I think that's one of the things that, ultimately at the end of the day, I love so much about the crossword is the fact that ever since, it was like a diamond shaped, the first crosswords were diamond shaped and then they like tilted square. And then that's about it. That's like, but I think that one of the things that, keeps bringing people back and back to the crossword is the fact that you know what it's going to be. Like it's a routine. It's always like there for you. And you don't know what's going to be in it, right? You don't know like, even, what kinds of clues, what kinds of wordplay. You're not sure like how you're going to get through to the other side, like how each thread of each clue is going to lead you through, but the arc of your emotions. As soon as you look at the crossword grid, you're like, okay, I'm about to be really frustrated if you're me. Like, I know that I'm about to be really frustrated. And then I'm about to feel really like snarky and triumphant. And then I'm about to get something wrong. And then I'm about to feel great again. And then I'm going to get something wrong. And then I'm going to feel like I've completed something and I've done this puzzle. So I think that the fact that the crossword pretty early on lighted on this form that was like, okay, I can encompass a lot of things, but I also am doable, solvable. I'm like flexible but rigid at the same time is what has made the kind of standard crossword just persist. And yeah, diagramless ones are like cool. Some people really get into acrostics, but I think you're right. Like that's never gonna have the same kind of like, you can't go from like super easy to super hard on a diagramless either. It's hard. So I think, yeah.
Well, one of the things I liked in the piece that you wrote for us at the Paris Review about the history of word games was sort of describing crosswords as this perfect crossing point between spatial puzzles and riddles, and that that each of those are things that our brains are just naturally attuned to wanting to do, and being able to do them both at once, solve the spatial puzzle and the riddle, is like deeply satisfying in some way that can't be replicated.
Yeah, exactly. And I think like the fact of that the grid with the squares, the black and white squares, it's like, yes, our brain, it's like, yeah, I really want to fill that thing.
I just have a really silly question. Maybe you answer it somewhere and I missed. So the editor Margaret Farrar at the New York Times institutes like these rules that then become golden rules for crossword puzzles, like that there shouldn't be more than 2 or 3. There shouldn't be 2 or 3 word answers, and there's 6% of the grid. Is that right? Like, should be less than 6% of the grid has to be black squares. That you shouldn't have like unchecked boxes. You shouldn't have dangling white squares. But also she institutes a strict desire for rotational symmetry, so that if you turn the grid 180 degrees, it's exactly the same. And why? Like, why does that seem so limiting in terms of like when you're describing trying to construct a puzzle, that becomes very complicated. Why should puzzles have rotational symmetry?
I think the honest answer to that is just aesthetics. Like, it just looks better when it's at rotational symmetry. And it really does. Like, you can look at some early crosswords that don't have rotational symmetry and they look sort of off and weird. And I think this also goes back to the point of like why the crossword has stuck around so long. It's that like, it's, part of it is this like beauty to it too, and part of it is like if you eliminate some of the freeformness of it, then by constricting it more, actually you can do a lot more within it too. So I think that like from all I've read and could gather, she just really instituted it because it just looks a lot better on the page. And then it's like a challenge of like, it's like, writing a sestina or something. It's like, okay, poets, like, make sure that it all fills in this form, and the correct sestina, or a sestina that deliberately breaks the rules, is going to be just, a better sestina than one that is just kind of loose and floppy.
That makes sense. I mean, so much of the pleasure of it is in the limitation of it, and that's true of all games. And another thing I sort of wonder about all games, you tell this anecdote about this anecdote that seems like a really foundational anecdote for your family, where your brother is at a Little League game and his team has lost and he's sobbing, and your mom tells him that he doesn't have to play sports if he doesn't want to, and through his tears he says, "But Mom, I love competition." And I'm wondering, like, what is it that we find so satisfying about these forms of competition where we don't win money for doing a crossword puzzle? What is it that draws us to this way of testing ourselves over and over again?
Yeah, I mean, that is definitely a foundational anecdote for our family. Sort of like wander around and say, "Mommy, I love competition." It's very true. I think there's so many drives to this, and then it's like, you're right, like, what does competition mean then if it's not for monetary gain, or it's not for a particular prize, or it's actually just like competition against yourself, basically. Yeah.
And I've noticed among my friends, I mean, I have some friends who just do not like games. It doesn't mean that they're not ambitious people or that they don't try hard at other things. They just don't understand the point of playing a game. And then other friends who are completely obsessed by games in general. And what is that function?
Yeah, I mean, it's true. I also have friends who say, I really hate the crossword. I really don't like it. Like, I can't get into it, and I don't even want to be good at them. I don't want to play a board game. I don't want to play games at all. And like, I can respect them as people, but I also have to respect
that I can respect them as people didn't sound fully convincing.
No, I love you guys. No, I do think that, you know, whether it comes out in games or like, I do think maybe it is a difference between some people's lizard brains and some people's not. But I think that there is something, at least for me, where like it kind of lets me like sort of be both like on and off my guard a little bit more. I think about like games sort of let me you know, become like sort of my best and worst self at the same time, but I don't sort of have to put up a veneer, or I don't have to like pretend that I'm like, you know, super chill and cool and everything's fine. And like, so I guess like, speaking just for myself in a game, I can kind of like really be totally focused, zoned in, like kind of pour my psychology into it, but it's also enough removed. It's like not totally myself either, you know? So it's like, I can be both 1,000% committed to it and 1,000% in it, but then also at the end of the day, like walk away from it and be a different, so it's like it allows me at least to like be a slightly different person in that moment, which I think is just like kind of a nice or like necessary sometimes release. So yeah, I think that yeah, I'm seeing that Dan Popick, I know, has written about how he doesn't like games, but
But this relates so nicely to something that you write about, specifically about the crossword and how it relates to our subconscious mind, and how crosswords are done deliberately to avoid doing something else, that, such as like a time you described being in a fight with a friend, and then each completing the Sunday crossword, and by the time you were done, somehow like the simmering rage from that had worked itself out subconsciously. And they are also something that you have to sort of not do in order to do them, in the ways in which you're instructed to walk away from the puzzle when you can't solve something, and then just let the clue arise subconsciously and come to you when you return.
Exactly. And I think I will say that in doing all the research and talking for this book, what I've loved the most is that when you say crossword puzzle to people, maybe like 9 times out of 10, the first thing they'll say is, oh, that makes me think of this, my grandmother, my aunt, my uncle, my best friend, my, you know, the weird person in college who I sat next to all the time, this person, that, but like it immediately, you know, games are this like sort of separate thing, but it actually immediately gets people to talking about something that's very intimate to themselves, and usually some sort of relationship that's very intimate. And it's a way of both kind of escaping yourself, but then having a conversation in a world, in a space in which you can relate really immediately and closely to people who are very close to you. So that, I think, really draws me in with games more than even the like a sort of escape psychological fantasy. It's that it is this space where people do come together and are more human.
Yeah, that's really nice. Why do you think that in our sort of, because I'm sure a lot of people are doing crossword puzzles right now, but the cliched quarantine thing to be doing is a jigsaw puzzle. And how are those things different, and why have jigsaw puzzles captured the public imagination so much right now over crossword puzzles?
And I also think about, I talk about this in my book, but there's this French novel by Georges Perec where, oh my God, why am I blanking on it? But like, it's that novel, Life a User's Manual, but the novel is constructed like a jigsaw puzzle basically, and it's like about people in separate apartments living. And there's a moment where like it's about a jigsaw puzzle. The novel's constructed like a jigsaw puzzle, and then there's a moment where there's an unfinished crossword puzzle sitting in the middle of like one of these like sort of jigsaw piece novels. So it's like there in the world is a jigsaw puzzle, but then there's this like crossword puzzle that's still to be solved within the jigsaw puzzle. No, sorry, that's like not quite answering your question, Nadja, but I've been thinking so much about that like moment of like within all these jigsaw puzzles, there's still a crossword puzzle.
That's true. I think that's a fine answer. People are doing jigsaw puzzles just to avoid doing the crossword puzzle, which they won't.
That's absolutely true.
There's so many more things I want to ask you, and I want to take questions, and I don't want this to go on forever. So maybe I'll ask you now to show us some of the images that you have on your screen that
Okay,
you
so
put
let's
aside for this.
pull them up. And hopefully I can get my screen to share. So hopefully some people will see this. So let's see. Can you? I'll start with this guy. Can you see it? Okay.
I can.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah. No, I just wanted to start with my own personal crossword fashion. This is me at age 7 in a pencil costume that I requested for Halloween, and my mom made for me. And then I remember when my editor Will Hayward she first showed me the cover art for the book, and it was by Ilya Milstein, this like brilliant illustrator, and it's this woman holding a pencil, and Will and I had a joke that, like, you know, he's like, oh, I thought you would identify with the woman, and it turns out that I identify with the pencil. But so I've been, like, I guess, writing this book since I was 7. But yeah, I did want to show a couple of crossword fashion things. Like, this is a really lovely kind of bathing beauties photo where they're wearing, I think these are homemade crossword stockings. But I love it because, like, there was a clothier in Paris in the 20s who was like making crossword pattern stockings for Americans coming to France.
Well, is that, I'm trying to remember that anecdote that you tell in your book. He like sees 2 American women doing crosswords through a window and then does them on a pattern. But crosswords are not popular in France yet, so people are like, what is this?
That's exactly it. It's like the Americans are doing crosswords. He's like, that's a cool pattern. Then the Americans in France go crazy for it and buy the pattern. But yeah, French crosswords aren't a thing yet. So they're like, these are just garish and horrible. I think they look really smart. I like these.
I think those women look very intelligent, yes.
Favorite ever, the one on the left, the brilliant constructor Anna Scheckman at some point posted this on Facebook, and I asked her where she found it, and she was like, the internet. And but I love this woman's, like, everything about this is just like the inception of crosswords and fashion. And this like enamel bangle, and then oh yeah, this was like from a designer's collection in 2015, Lisa Perry. This designer just if you zoom in, it's like not really a great crossword. She just kind of like took the idea of the crossword and made it fashion. But I love these, like especially this one on the left, her full on kind of 3-piece crossword look. Let's see. Oh yeah, this is like another good one to go along with like just the world turning into crosswords. This is like a cartoon by the cartoonist Ernie Bushmiller, who's most famous for Nancy. But
I read all these sections of your book out loud to my dad, who's into comics. He liked them.
I was hoping your dad would like them. Yeah, but I don't know if your dad has ever tried to draw crossword grids. I really hope not. But that's how Ernie Bushmiller got his start. But then he like decided to make a cartoon strip crossword Cal. So this is one of them that I include in my book. But it's like people going to the zoo and just instead of the animal names, they're 3-letter dromaeus and 7-letter anthropoid. Bacteria. So like the entire world, I like the idea of the entire world just becoming fodder for a crossword puzzle. Let me see if I've got like one more kind of cool.
Do you have a wrist dictionary? Because I really wanted to see what those looked like.
I've been searching online for those, so if you can find me a wrist dictionary.
I really want one.
This is something, yeah, I mean, I've just got 2 on this slide. So I like Barbie doing crossword puzzles. We were talking about gender and crossword puzzles.
You have this amazing chapter of your book that is just a really, really, really close read of a Sex and the City episode and how crosswords function as bromide, as foreplay, as metaphor, as It's
I couldn't believe it. I thought I was just procrastinating, and it turned out I was doing deep research for my by like going back into early Sex in the City.
That was the first thing I really wanted to ask you was how did you do this research? Both the historical research, where did you find that information, and also all of the times when you cross-referenced. Wait, stay in there. You can keep. I want to keep looking at things.
Oh, yeah,
But all of the times when can you just also keep moving through them a little bit because I'm so excited to see what you have in here. But all the times when you cross-reference crosswords and pop culture, how did you find all of those pop culture references? Were they just everywhere all the time?
Yeah, well, I'll just also point out really quick, this thing on the right is a crossword pinball machine that's in Will Schwartz's basement. Which is like exactly what I think one wants to find in Will Schwartz's basement, is a crossword pinball machine. No, yeah, how did I find all of these things? Well, it turns out that when your like crossword puzzle book also becomes your dissertation, then like I just like I mean, at a certain point they were just kind of they were kind of everywhere. I hit the point of saturation in the research where I was seeing crosswords everywhere. I was like, oh my God, I would go into like a bathroom and the tiles would be black and white and be like, oh my God, I'm like standing in crossword. There's been other books that have been written kind of about crosswords. Like there's, especially around the 100-year anniversary of the crossword in 1913, there's, I mentioned Ben Tazig, his book on the history of the crossword. There was this book called Two Girls, One on Each Knee that was like about the history of crosswords. So that kind of led me to a lot of the crossword ephemera trivia stuff. And then really it was just, and then I would find like, oh, it's been, crossword was referenced in this one Agatha Christie mystery. So then I like went back and started looking in other short stories and in other poems. And at a certain point also my friends were in on this and sending me all the like crossword literature references. And then Sex in the City was really truly, it was like, you know, midnight and I was procrastinating. I was like, oh, I'll just go through old Sex in the City episodes. And then that was like, wow, I'm really not avoiding it. They're everywhere. Another.
Oh my God, I want this.
Yeah, her dress is so good. I love her shoes too. They're sort of like in the motif.
Do you want to show us one or two? Because I know the other thing that you gathered and that I wanted to talk about, we're not going to have as much time as I wanted, was the history of word games, the precursor to crosswords. Do you want to show us a few early word games?
Yeah, I can show you a few. Well, this is a great cigar box that, because I like it. It says not a puzzle, a cigar in it. And then let's see. This is the first crossword puzzle, just to have that on the screen, maybe. Yeah, some early word games. So I can try to bring it up. There's but like the sort of 5x5 word puzzle, the Satyr Square. Let me stop sharing for a second so I can pull it up on my screen. Let's see if I can find it.
I'll just tell the audience now that the way we're going to do questions, also, first of all, thank you so much to everyone who is looking at a computer screen for an hour longer than they have to. It's so nice that people are here. And we're going to do questions by having you type them into the chat. So if you want to type questions into the chat while we're wrapping up the conversation, then we'll have them to start picking from.
So I should have loaded this one up before I forgot to, but I'll just pull it up now. So yeah, this is probably the one to show. So this is like the Satyr Square, so you can just see that it's SATOR, ROTAS down there, and then all of it's like a sort of perfect magic square. It's SATOR, ROTAS, opera, arepo, tenet, opera, arepo, rota. Like it sort of reads back and forth itself. So this was kind of the like Kilroy was here of ancient Rome and the Roman Empire. This little Satyr Square was this magical people thought it was this magical thing that all of these letters could be crossed back and forth on each other and still make a sentence. It's like the farmer Arepo like tends his fields is basically kind of what it means. And because word order doesn't matter in Latin, you can read it every which way. And so this was, I think, one of the earliest, I talked about this in the article I wrote for you guys, like one of the earliest precursors to a crossword grid, and thinking about what do letters mean in a grid and how can we get letters to kind of all work together and form words. And then this idea that it was such like a beautiful thing that these letters could do this like this particular square became this kind of magical signal in the Roman Empire. And yeah, so that was, and then other word squares like that. So the early word squares, I think, are probably the most visually appealing of some of the earliest like crossword things. But yeah, like, so there was these early word squares and then early riddles. Riddles have been around in oral culture for forever. And then the crossword kind of marries the two, but way later in history than I thought it would.
I'm going to go to questions from the audience. So this one is from Lindsay Turner. Hi, Adrienne. You're also a poet. You mentioned the sestina earlier, but could you talk a little about poetry and crosswords?
Yeah, so, no, hi, Lindsay. And yeah, so I think that, like, I find it's really fascinating because, like, crosswords are doing, you know, things with words, asking you to hear different associations with words and asking you to, like, make different assumptions about words. And poetry is doing the same thing often, but poetry also operates on sometimes more intuitive, more emotional levels. Like the forms are kind of made to be broken in poetry, whereas in crosswords, forms are made to be more formal. There are lots of poets who love crosswords and lots of poets who can't stand crosswords and lots of poets who are ambivalent. But some of the stories I love about poets who love crosswords is just like another way of thinking about poetry and crosswords is like Auden was a super crossword fanatic, and there's a great story of like a reporter who goes to his house and like they have to spend a lot of their time doing the crossword puzzle. And Auden, like Sondheim, really disdained easy crosswords, and like he loved these sort of hard cryptic crosswords. And I mean, and he actually like he talks about crosswords in his poetry sometimes. And I think for like Auden and Eliot, and I know Alice Notley does crosswords, for a lot of poets, it can become a place where James Merrill, like a crossword is a way of sort of like a fidget spinner, and like in a much more sophisticated fidget spinner of like working your way through the ways that letters and words and language are all playing out, doing all these different combinations. It's a place where your mind can kind of like be stimulated by language, but also relax in language and play with it in different ways. So that's, I like to think of crosswords as another activity that's kind of running along parallel to writing poems a lot of the time.
Jenny Land Mackenzie has a follow-up question, which is, do you know if any famous writers of sestinas also constructed crossword puzzles? How analogous are those forms?
Hi, Jenny. Hi, Jenny. So, yeah, I know that James Merrill, one of the, who, you know, writes sestinas and gets in his like famous The Changing Light at Sandover, where he's doing the Ouija board with his partner and they have, you know, this like tomes and stuff. He actually like gets the Ouija board to make him a double sestina. So like, and he contacts Auden on the Ouija board. So there's lots of crossover crossword puzzles. So Merrill, I don't know if Merrill wrote crossword puzzles, but he wrote really like intense word games in the like in his notebooks, in the margins, in his doodles that are like very crosswordy like. And then those sorts of word games start appearing in the way that he's crossing words backwards and forwards in his poetry. So yeah, not necessarily like submitting them to the New York Times, but he is building word games at the same time that the Ouija board is building him double Sestinas.
Mariam Ramani has a question that I'm so glad someone asked, because I wanted to ask you too. I love how this conversation started out with a confrontation of gender and crosswords and the culture around them. Could we hear Adrienne talk about the crosswords relationship to race, class, and how that's changed over the decades? Big question, but the highlights.
Yeah, I know, Mariam, you're always going to ask, just like tiny questions. Yeah, so, and I'm so glad you asked that, because the relationship between crossword and race is really interesting, because I talk about this in my book. I think like for a long time, the crosswords sort of implicitly was a place where like all the references were usually to like dead white male authors, if that was going to be your literature reference, or to like dead white male figures in history. And like there's it was like, it's a world in which it's, you don't see the race of the constructors, but often for a long time it was mostly stereotypically white people constructing for white audiences, unfortunately. And like I think that's, and then it gets perpetuated by the references within the crossword puzzle. And so crossword editors have a certain kind of audience member in mind, and so the cultural references get tilted in a certain way, and it just becomes this cycle, right? So I think that definitely when Shorts took over in '93 and made the crossword, kind of exploded the kind of cluing and diversity available in this like big mainstream New York Times crossword, that was definitely a start towards more cultural references being represented within the crossword itself, which then I think made more people from all kinds of backgrounds. Since once you can see yourself in the crossword, then you think, oh, I'm a person who can construct crosswords. So I think when the crossword became sort of like woke and savvy to the fact that, oh, maybe we're just representing a super small slice of life here, maybe we shouldn't do that anymore. Yeah, so I think that the cross world has recently become much more aware that we can't just kind of make these cultural assumptions. We have to be more particular and prominent. And I remember, like, Nadja, we were talking about, like, when I was, like, going through the Paris Review interviews, trying to construct the Paris Review crossword, like, I was realizing, we were both sort of had the realization at the same time that, like, oh my God, I'm just, like, pulling on all these, like, old dead white male authors, but actually, like, the crossword can be this beautiful representation of all cross sections of culture.
Emma Komlos-Hrubsky asks, curious to know what challenges there are in creating crosswords in languages other than English. For example, maybe languages that use a lot more or a lot fewer vowels.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I know I have some friends who have talked about doing the crossword in French, and maybe Nadja, you like might be able to do crosswords in French more than I can. But I know that in French and Italian crosswords, you can actually create grids that have many fewer black squares in them, because words are so much more vowel heavy, and like you can kind of create bigger word squares with fewer black words, because it's like words are using fewer letters. So it's, you see what I'm saying? So it's like easier to get them stacked on top of each other. So actually you can create these like more open grids more easily in different languages, which is really cool. And French and Italian, it's like, I know there are newspapers with really robust crossword cultures in them.
Let's see, we'll take two more questions. So Thessaly's question is, what was the hardest puzzle you've tried to solve, and why was it so challenging for you?
Hi, Thessaly. So this, I can definitely say that, so my family, as a family friend of ours, his father was one of the most notoriously constructed the most notorious, fiendishly difficult cryptic crosswords. So these British crosswords, like he actually had like a Christmas newsletter of cryptic crosswords that he sent around to people, including Sondheim and including Leonard Bernstein. Like he had this like his crossword name was Apex, like that was his pseudonym, and so like he would send around these really super hard crosswords. I looked at one of his Christmas crosswords. I looked at a few of his Christmas crosswords, and Thessaly, like I had the answers sitting there. I had the clues sitting there. And I was so proud of myself when I figured out how to like connect one of the clues to one of the answers. Like that moment for me was like, wow, I like actually am literally sitting here with the answer this puzzle, and I'm super proud of myself that I like figured out one of the connections to them. So that was definitely like this cryptic crossword that was built as like the Christmas cryptic crossword, the hardest thing, like you're supposed to sit down in your time of holiday and solve the hardest puzzle ever. Like with the answers there, I could barely solve one of them.
And then last question from Leslie Jameson. Adrienne, so thrilling to be here. My question is a follow-up to Lindsay's on poetry and crosswords. Do you feel like your relationship to crosswords as lover or scholar has inflected your relationship to constraint in your own poetry, to pushing up against forms more generally? Did your dissertation and your book feel like different forms of generative constraint? Too many questions, answer only what feels rich.
Hey, Leslie, so good to see you here. So yeah, I think that's a great question, and yeah, there's so much there. I'll say a couple of things. I think that, you know, my relationship to crosswords really like kind of remarkably has stayed very like constant throughout the whole process. It's like I'm pretty average as a doer of crosswords. I've gotten better at them. I've certainly gotten more excited about them as I've done it. But like my relation to them is like continued fascination for the things I find in this form and the ways that people are using this form and the ways that people relate to this form. Like the deeper and deeper I go, the more I realize like how like completely subtle differences can change everything. So just continued fascination for them, awe and admiration for people who are like great solvers and great constructors. And I think that, yeah, so, but also like, I think that like, I maintain this sort of like utter love and fascination for them, but I also maintain like a very slight remove in a certain way. And I guess my relationship to constraint in my own poetry, as a poet, I am someone who's obsessed with form, and I think a lot about how to push through form and then how to break form and how to do that. And so I've found myself, as I was writing this book, sort of maybe it's inevitable, but I found myself kind of like, as I was thinking more and more about form and crosswords and how to create a book that tells a story about crosswords, I found my own poetry kind of going haywire in terms of form. Like all I wanted to do was both like create the kookiest things and break the form at the same time and really like sort of like push out of my own boundaries. So just as I was like finding more in constraint, I also wanted to break form more. So yeah, like just pushing at all extremes.
Okay, I'm not going to keep people longer than an hour, even though there's so many more things that we could talk about. But I so recommend, if you are interested in knowing more about the history of early word games, about gender and crosswords, race and crosswords, incredibly intense competitions in crosswords, what it's like to go on a crossword-themed cruise, or any of those things, that you purchase and read this book. And thank you so much to Powerhouse for hosting this.
Thank you, and thank you so much, Nadja. This has just been such a delight to talk to you about this book. I'm so pleased that we got to do this. Yeah, thank you, Powerhouse. Thank you, everybody here. Thank you, everybody here. I can't see you all, but thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming, and make sure to buy the book.
Yeah.
Thank you.